What do they want? Are we about to come face to face with them, whether we're ready or not? Find out from the world's leading experts in this very special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio.
You're listening to RNN Radio, where thinking people tune in. Well, this is the Raiders Live News Talk Radio show. I am your host, of course, as always, Tom Horn, and am joined in the studio this evening by that beautiful pontificative pony power herself, Nita.
That would be me.
And that guitar assassinating wild man of the Ozarks, Joe Artis.
Hey, hey.
And we welcome you back to this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio on the timely subject, official disclosure, prepare for contact. This hour, it is our pleasure to talk with Dr. Mike Hieser, Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before attending the UW-Madison, Mike earned an M.A. in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania. Mike's other academic interests include paranormal and occult religions and Western esotericism. He is particularly interested in how these worldviews and traditions have historically drawn on biblical and ancient Near Eastern material and in turn influenced biblical interpretation on the popular level. Of course, Mike's become well known throughout numerous radio appearances for his critiques of parababble and inside-the-box religious thinking, but he might be most well known to his popular audiences for his paranormal thriller, The Facade, which intertwines many of these interests. And now from somewhere inside his secret laboratory in the state of Washington, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio, Professor Michael Hieser. Good evening, Mike.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for that intro.
Well, there's so much more that could be said, and that's part of the problem when talking with you. But frankly, we have been in particular looking forward to talking to you, partly because we want to bend your mind on this subject of panspermia, which has been in these conversations in the Royal Society and in the news lately. And you have these impressive credentials, as well, of course, as your heralded expertise at blending challenging concepts like astrobiology, panspermia, the idea of ET contact with theology and philosophy. Just frankly, not very many people have the same kind of qualifications that you do. We have a lot of territory to cover tonight, and people are going to want to hear you talk and not me. So I want to get your response to start with just to this avalanche of recent news. All this stuff's been in the headlines. I must have 20 headlines right now sitting in front of me that have come out in the last couple of weeks, all of them talking about, are we alone in the universe? Some people like Drake want to extend our presence into searching out there to see if somebody's watching us. Yesterday, the royal astronomer to the Queen, Lord Reese, said aliens might be staring us in the face and we wouldn't even know it. And then there are some of those people in the Royal Society that are warning, what if these aliens decide they don't like us? Maybe they're not benign. Maybe they think that we look like a pretty good sandwich. And so what can you tell us about what's been going on with these meetings and your feelings about it?
Well, part of me just wants to look at this and say, this is the definition of the word bluster, because there's nothing new here in terms of the content. This is something that, honestly cycles through the news, once or twice a year. I look at it, and the cynical side of me wants to say, I guess it's funding time for SETI. So we have to put this in front of the public so that someone somewhere will get motivated to increase their contribution or make a contribution to this effort. But, on the other hand, about the only thing that's really new is the number of people, credentialed people, scientists who I think are willing, well, it's not I think, they're obviously willing if they're putting their names out there, but they're willing to get on this bandwagon, and promote this idea. And it never really ceases to amaze me how people like scientists who, they make their living by being rational, or at least, saying that they're rational. And they'll come out with really outlandish claims on the basis of no evidence at all, and frankly, really not a whole lot of reason to be optimistic, although they'll refer to things like the Drake equation, like that's, the source of all optimism about finding ET, or it should be the source of all optimism. So I'm a bit jaded when it comes to this, but I think the real importance is the psychology of it for the public. I am one who believes that there's a greater intelligence out there, and I don't speak in that sentence of God. I'm talking about the other side here, that there is an intelligence that is out to manipulate the public, wants to expand and reinforce and maintain certain ideas in the minds of as many people as possible about who we are and how we got here and do we matter and if we matter in what way and what's our destiny, and really big picture theological questions. So I look at something like the Royal Society meeting again as it's pure bluster when it comes to factual information, but psychologically it has a real importance to sort of moving and shifting the paradigm in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. So if nothing else, even if it's mostly bluster, it's raising the legitimacy of the conversation?
Well, I think that, but I think even more. I tend to be, I'm one who believes that it doesn't matter if there ever really is extraterrestrial life, because I think the idea will be put forth in the mainstream whether it's real or not. And so I'm more interested in why the idea is out there, how useful it is, what its place is in a bigger agenda, what role it will play in molding people's beliefs, really turning them away from anything that we would call traditional theism, and of course, that includes traditional Judeo-Christian, worldview, Christianity in particular. So I'm one that believes that it just doesn't really matter whether they come up with evidence or not, and I think that there will be certain things in my lifetime that are latched onto, that are offered as proof. And I think if the scientific community is, like Paul Davies this time talking about, the aliens are among us, and the chances are better than ever that we're going to have the discovery of intelligent extraterrestrial life. They're not talking real sense when it comes to that, because to date, not a single life form at any level, microbial or upward, has been discovered on Earth from space or in space. What you have are the components of life. But any scientist will tell you, that they still sort of got their thinking processes intact. Any scientist will tell you that the components of life, it's easy to get those in a lab. Creating life is something altogether different. So even under forced, guarded conditions in our laboratories now, trying to create artificial life, you take the lack of success there, and then you move it out into space, where it's just random, undirected processes. It's so far from actually being established that, I have to look at it and wonder, well, why aren't you speaking rationally at this point? I really think it's a religious thing. I think they want so badly to believe in this, to have this as a core thing in their reason for being scientists, and sort of a core component of their worldview, that they're willing to overlook the obvious, that hey, we actually don't have any proof for this, but it's always, it's just around the corner. It's kind of like the Cubs winning the World Series. This next year will be the year, it's that sort of thinking, and I think that eventually they'll offer something that under real scrutiny, kind of like Ida the lemur was supposed to be the missing link, a year ago. Mm-hmm. They'll latch onto something, put it out in front of the public, and then that'll be the plaything of the scientific community for panspermia or ET life. And and it'll succeed in shifting the way people think and the way people talk about origins. And I'm more interested in that as something that I really believe will occur in my lifetime. That to me is as important or more important, just the way it affects people's belief systems, rather than actually being able to point to something and saying, yeah, that is an alien life form right there.
Mm-hmm. And wasn't earlier this year, they landed that probe near one of the, on Mars, near the North Pole or whatever it was on Mars, and they actually made the comment that they had found life. I haven't heard very much about that since.
You won't. You find the conditions for life. You find the things that make up life. You don't actually have anything that would be that you could call an organic life form or microbial life. It's always, well, are they locked in the ice? Or at one time in Mars past, the conditions would have been just right. Well, yeah, maybe they are locked in the ice somewhere, but give us one. It's always the table setting and never the meal.
Mm-hmm.
And
is part of that.
Again,
go ahead. Is part of that because of the limits thus far of our technological advancement? I mean, we're just now getting to the point where we can send a rover or a probe or something to another planet, and now maybe part of their excitement is, as they're looking into these studies in Antarctica and volcanism and different places, and they're finding how these extreme, phobes can exist in very extreme conditions, that there is this hope then that if we are seeing some of these markers for life, that perhaps, if nothing else, we're talking about microbial existence?
Yeah, I think that the technological advances are, fueling some of the enthusiasm, and that's actually more coherent than something as silly as the Drake equation, because then you can actually get there. I mean, personally, I wouldn't be surprised if there's actually life, at some level, elsewhere in the solar system, or we have to speak of the solar system really now, because that's really what's, and even a very small portion of the solar system that's actually within our grasp of actual exploration. But yeah, I think you're right in that observation that that's what fuels a lot of it. But see, that just moves you to the next question. Let's just say that they find organisms that are either identical to or similar to organisms on Earth that are not carbon-based, but that live in some of these extreme environments. Well, the next question is obviously, okay, are these ones on Earth, did they come from space? How would you ever hope to prove that? Because there's one school of panspermia. It's sort of considered a little more extreme, but one school of panspermia actually postulates that life has existed everywhere, from the very beginning in the entire universe. Let's just say that might be the case. That would be part of the stuff of creation, or this, obviously an atheist isn't going to refer to it really like that. But you could have two things occurring at widely disparate points, and that's the factual part. Oh, life form A, life form B, and they're sure a whole lot alike or even identical. But to say that life form A was caused by life form B, or life form A came from the very same thing that produced life form B, those are entirely different questions, and quite beyond the discovery of an actual extraterrestrial organism. But nevertheless, you can imagine if you have that, people are going to extrapolate that baby to death, and it's going to really have an impact on the way people think about their own point of origin. The origins of life on Earth and human life, and all the way up the chain.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Frank Drake a couple of different times as a headline this week. Drake wants off-world listening posts for aliens. He wants put some kind of a listening device. I was trying to find it here again, but anyway, something like, I forget what it even was, 82 million kilometers out into space or something. And but his original equation, I think, came up with maybe the possibility of 10,000 habitable worlds, which sounds like a lot until You consider how many billions of worlds they say may exist, and it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack. So I've always been a little bit confused about how different camps. One camp will say it's a very hopeful idea that you could have 10,000 habitable worlds, and then other people look at it and say it's extraordinarily pessimistic.
Well, I actually just recently blogged about the Drake equation over on UFO Religions, and you can find sources that actually say that the original result of his equation, for your listeners that aren't familiar with this, Frank Drake is an astronomer and astrophysicist, and in 1961 there was a conference that out of which really came the idea for SETI as a scientific discipline. There was something called the Green Bank meeting, and in 1961 scientists met there. Drake was one of them, and he came up with this equation to sort of postulate how many civilized worlds there could be out there that we might be able to make contact with. And it's this long, mathematical equation: n equals r asterisk times fp times ne times 3 or 4 other things. And each of them has a meaning. Each of the symbols has a meaning. Like n is the number of civilizations in our galaxy that we might be able to talk to. R is the average rate of star formation. Fp is the fraction of those stars that have planets. Ne, the average number of planets that can potentially support life, so on and so forth. And you can actually find sources that the end result of that was 10, not 10,000.
Oh.
And scientists have actually gone back to the Drake equation. The easiest place for listeners to get a quick overview of the Drake equation is actually Wikipedia, and they can find some sources there too. But people have gone back over the Drake equation. That was in the 60s, and so astrophysicists know a lot more now about each one of those equation components. Mm-hmm. And they've recalculated, and the answer now is 2.31. So let's just round it off. So there's possibly 2 galaxies out there that could sustain life and we could be able to communicate with them. It's incredible that this equation is what generates all this optimism and enthusiasm. Most scientists look at this and actually consider it even worse than that, because if you actually look at some of these things in the equation, like the average number of planets that can potentially support life, well, how do we know that? It's a guess. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically every one except for 1 or 2 factors in the equation are a complete suck-it-out-of-your-thumb guess. It's playing with numbers. And, people like Michael Crichton and other scientists have called the Drake equation just worthless. And I'm inclined to agree with them. I think people really should do the math here, pardon the pun, and look at this and say, look, this is this great equation. It's like a creed now. Mm-hmm. Within the ET life community. It's a point of dogma. Oh, look at the Drake equation. You people are crazy if you don't think there's aliens out there. The Drake equation. Yeah, what about the Drake equation?
Well, what
are the odds really?
Yeah, do you think there are any new approaches, though, to astrobiology that could be game changers? Like in the last few years, there has been, I think, almost like 400 extrasolar planets found. A lot of them are hot Jupiters and super Earths and whatever they, hot Neptunes and whatever they call them. But some of them are exoplanets and some of them are water worlds. I'm trying to remember if it was Gliese or whatever it was, 581. Do you think that kind of approach to space exploration, or the attempt to try to find a habitable world, is a better method than the theory of Drake, or even SETI for that matter, sending signals just out into the middle of space?
Yeah, SETI has been a complete failure. I mean, it's over 20 years old now. And, I want to be, I'm not unsympathetic, to what SETI's trying to do, and the technology does keep getting better and better and better. But it seems to me like if you're able scientifically to assess some of the things that you just mentioned, then it might make more sense to put the resources into those. And frankly, why not put the resources into a manned mission to Mars? you know, that we do have the technology for getting something there. We know that now. It's not a guess. You know, we actually could pull that off. And why not put the resources into that? Well, it's because, you know, maybe that's not the province of Drake and some of his pals that founded the SETI movement. You know, you get these petty rivalries. You get people who get older, and essentially, I hate to put it this way, but they want to validate their professional lives for the positions they've taken. And I think they get a little bit blinded by the wish, you know, to be shown right, you know, to essentially have their professional careers validated here. I think that, you know, we would be better off if this is a real important thing to put the resources and the effort into something else, you know, besides SETI. But SETI is sort of entrenched. You know, I don't know if it's iconic in its status, but it's been around for a while. People know what it is, and you know, there's this popular fascination with it. You know, who knows if that's ever going to happen, to put the kind of resources into something else.
Yeah. Let me ask you just a few quick questions about panspermia. You can just give me short answers if you want to.
Sure.
And I also would have you explain what panspermia is, since we're talking about it, and I know there will be a lot of people listening to the show that doesn't even know what it is or what it means. Some of the stuff coming out of the Royal Society, recent news surrounding questions involving a professor from Cardiff University who was quoted during these meetings as saying, quote, "New evidence from astrobiology overwhelmingly supports the view that life was seeded from outside Earth when microbes were deposited on this planet approximately 3.8 million years ago," end quote. Any response to that? And also do explain basically what panspermia even means.
Yeah, panspermia in its simplest definition is the idea that life was seeded from space. In other words, life here on Earth somehow had its origin from particles, from elements that came here. And once those building blocks of life were deposited here, and of course then you get the question of mechanism. Well, how did they get here? But skipping that problem, once you get them here, then the building blocks of life, you know, came together in the process of evolution, and voila, you know, we have life as we know it here. So that's the basic definition. There are two major types: directed and undirected. Undirected means the processes were random. Directed means that either God or other, you know, extraterrestrials, greater life forms, seeded life elsewhere in the universe, including Earth. Cosmic ancestry actually denies all of that. Cosmic ancestry is the idea that says when the Big Bang happened, the building blocks were seeded everywhere all at once, and you don't really need the mechanism idea. So there's different variations, but basically life came from space, and that's what panspermia is. Now, the scientist you refer to is Chandra Wickrama Singh, and he's not new. He's been around for 20, 30 years. He was an early proponent of panspermia. He's probably one of the more famous people because for many years, he was practically the only guy pushing the idea. He has more friends now. But, you know, I would say to Professor Wickrama Singh, because I've read his material, you know, and I've read what the popular media puts out, show me the life form. Just show me the life form, because really what all that he's got, this overwhelming evidence, is he has things like you mentioned, the extrasolar planets and all this sort of thing. There are places where possibly the building blocks are there, and maybe even that some life form has evolved or is still there from a prior evolution. In other words, he's got nothing, but he has more places to look. Okay, more places that it might be found. The other thing he has is there have been new ideas put forth as to the viability of mechanism, that if you believe the building blocks of life are out into space, how do you get it to Earth? The typical explanation was, you know, meteorites. You know, meteorites carrying some microbial form of life land on Earth and then life takes hold and that sort of thing. Now there are other possible mechanisms being entertained, but of course we don't actually have data, cause and effect data for any of that. We just have, again, more ideas. So I don't know how that adds up to overwhelming. It adds up to, hey, there's more here to think about. But, if you're trying to push the idea, you really believe in it, like he does, then you're going to use a little bit of hyperbole in your language. But, he doesn't have anything that, there's nothing new as far as an actual, here's the smoking gun. Panspermia actually worked. And again, I don't know what you would really be able to do, because even if you found a life form here that matches a life form out in space, how do you argue coherently and successfully, scientifically, that one, is the result of the other? How do you do that, as opposed to, again, a cosmic ancestry idea?
Mm-hmm. And speaking of hyperbole, I mean, that's one of the things that has been interesting. Is there have been several grandiose statements, which kind of seems to be in contrast to the fact that we're talking about a society of scientists. Some of these guys are peer-reviewed scientists using language like we have unprecedented evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. That's totally different than saying, we have evidence that strongly suggests there could be microbial life on Europa. That's not, some of the comments coming out here, unprecedented evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence overwhelmingly supports the view. So,
all right, well, frankly, I'll believe that when the mainstream scientific community says, here's the data. It can be peer-reviewed now by people outside our little circle of cheerleaders for this idea, and we're going to build consensus now. And when all those things happen, that used to be what was known as the scientific process. Okay, putting your idea out there, having external peers look at it and build consensus. Again, I don't want to sound too harsh, because if you believe in an idea, you need cheerleaders. Okay, you need people to up the rhetoric a little bit. You need funding. You need enthusiasm. You need to do this stuff. Where that it crosses from that to just being misleading, that's a separate question. For me, that's a shorter trip than maybe for somebody else to actually call it misleading. So you need some of that. And I understand that I can give them a pass a little bit on it, but I do think it's bluster. Right now it's just bluster. But they do have more they can look at. I will grant them that, and they ought to just say that. We believe this hypothesis will one day be validated. We've got more material to look at than we ever had before. We're going to get there someday. Please support us, rather than coming out like it's a foregone conclusion when they've got nothing. That's just not, to me, that's just not honest.
It is an interesting, though, time that we're living in. Because so many of these royal scientists, it's almost like we're kind of seeing a new age of enlightenment, or an intellectual movement that at one time, well, for that matter, the Vatican at one time would have persecuted, Galileo or whatever, and now they're talking about our space brothers coming to visit us. We were living in interesting times when intellectuals, astronomers, religious leaders are talking about some of this stuff, in fact, as a matter of faith, almost like a statement of religious persuasion, as opposed
actually
to
more honest.
But isn't that a fascinating day that we're living in, that we're seeing this happening? And it seems to have occurred rather rapidly.
Yeah, I think it's picked up steam a little bit. It's a little, I think that the rapidity of it is a little bit, I don't know what word to use here, but it's a little bit mythical. And here's what I mean by that. The church has been thinking about this question for centuries, but a lot of that discussion, if you're living in an age where knowledge can't be disseminated quickly, then, who's going to hear about it? The guy that lives down the hall in the monastery, well, that's big news. Maybe he'll get on a horse, in 20 miles and go on a trip or a picnic, and somebody else will hear. But you don't get the dissemination of the ideas, the material. But we only have it because we have their writings. We have things like the printing press, and then we had things like book binderies and book publishers, and eventually computers and the internet. So it's not like this question is new, but the rapidity of disseminating the ideas and the interaction, the discussion, that is certainly new, and it gives it the feel that, and I think it's more than a feel. I think it is real that you're starting to get this sort of critical mass of so many people at the same time entering the discussion and thinking about the question, and that works two ways. It motivates the scientific community. The public is motivated by the scientific community's work, and it goes back and forth. Then you get philosophers involved, you get theologians involved, you get biblical scholars involved, and it sort of mushrooms and snowballs. But as far as the church thinking about this, I mean, this goes all the way back to Augustine, talking about other worlds, and even before Augustine with the Greek philosophers, with the early church, interacted with. I mean, this is really, really an old question, and the church has had, Big C Church, has had varying opinions on it. In sweeping general terms here, once you get out of the Middle Ages, once you get past Aquinas, it's generally positive. That there really are other worlds out there. We should expect that there are, because to deny that is a denial of God's omnipotence. Saying that God couldn't have done something is a bad theological statement.
Well, he didn't say it nearly as eloquently as you just did, but we just interviewed Jesse Marcel before you came on, and Jesse's a Catholic, and I asked him about the Vatican and whatever, and essentially he said the same thing, that, for him, official disclosure would almost be affirming to the omnipotence of God. And
I don't doubt the genuineness of that statement on his part. I think many would feel that way.
Let me ask you two other quick questions, and we'll get past panspermia, because we do have other things we want to ask you about tonight. Second question about panspermia stems from Michael Mautner, if you know him, research professor of chemistry at Virginia Commonwealth University. And he has said recently that seeding the universe with life is not just an option, it's a moral obligation. And so now he's talking about directed panspermia, that we have, as humans, we have a purpose to propagate life, to take maybe transfer via microbial activity here from the earth, using our, advanced technology and crafts in the near future to take our basically biological matter and to seed the universe with it. Any response to that?
Yeah, it's interesting on two levels, because on the one hand, I don't know if he's a Christian of whatever stripe. If he was a Christian, I would not be surprised by that thinking, because life is a wonderful thing. It is a gift from God, and I don't know if I'd go so far as to say we have a moral imperative, because I don't see any scriptural imperative to do that. But the thinking is consistent. Life is a wonderful thing, and there ought to be its benefits ought to be distributed somewhere else. Okay, I get that. I could live with that. If he's not a Christian, it's at the very least ironic that he's talking about a moral imperative to do anything. Where would our moral authority, where would the moral imperative come from? From random, random life forms and proteins, and where's the moral imperative?
Right.
It doesn't jive philosophically, coherently. But I get the idea. Life is precious, and so on and so forth. No,
okay,
that's my initial reaction to it.
Well, one other question on this subject of panspermia has to do with the idea that planetary scientists now are announcing that maybe, on the ninth moon of Saturn or Europa, that there's subcrustal liquid oceans, and that they seem to be indicating traces of hydrocarbons and that sort of thing. That makes them think that life might exist there. In those seas, there is a theory that's been developed, at least by Dr. Walt Brown in his book, In the Beginning, Compelling Evidence for Creation and the Flood. And I'm not sure how many other subscribers there are to this, but when I became aware of it, I thought, when I get the chance, I'm going to ask Mike Hieser what he thinks about this. And he believes that the Earth also once had a subcrustal ocean like Europa did. This is called the hydroplate theory. And that during the Great Flood, when the Earth's crust was ruptured and the great seas of the deep broke up and all that, that it released this inner ocean with its water, mud, and that a part of this, some percentage of it, could have escaped into space and carried microbes from the Earth out there to Europa, Mars, whatever, and that if we ever, in fact, do find microbial life there, it's at least as good a theory as anything else in panspermia to say that it actually originated on Earth and went there, as opposed to it originated on Mars or whatever and came here. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know much about that specific articulation, but about the theory that it works both ways, yeah, I'm familiar with that. And you know, in general, that is a valid observation, because one of the problems, again, with panspermia is mechanism. And who is to say that if you find life elsewhere, it didn't come from Earth? Because it's really the same question. It's the same mechanism, issue, or problem. And, you know, frankly, the mechanisms that are used to get life here on Earth can equally be used to transmit life from Earth. So I'm in general agreement there. He's right. You know, there's no reason to say that it could only happen one way. I think that's quite valid. You know, as far as a connection, you know, because you find the subcrustal, you know, water in one place, that doesn't really, since we really don't know how life, and I speak here, you know, in evolutionary terms for the sake of the discussion, we really don't know what the full process is in terms of a template, because we've only got one place to look at, and that's here. So just because you find a structure somewhere else, and you find or you postulate, in this case, the same structure here on Earth, that doesn't necessarily follow that the processes that spring from that would be the same. I don't know if I'm saying that very well.
Yeah. Well, and
again, it's just another place to look. It's another possibility. But I think, you know, just generally speaking, the idea that, hey, you know, it might be out there and it might have come from here, that, you know, that's perfectly within the panspermia discussion. You know, that's not really how often where people, you know, park, or where people often park, but that is in the discussion.
Well, I'm somewhat suspicious that Guy Cosmonalco, who wrote his, you know, Intelligent Life in the Universe 50-page booklet last year or year before, time slips by quickly, whenever it was, but he had said in one interview following that people were interviewing about the book and what does the Vatican actually believe, and he said that he was working on his next project, which he called a mind-bending concept that he was referring to as the Jesus seed theory. And because he had said this within the context of astrobiology or even how life might migrate from one place to the other, I found this directed panspermia theory, you know, kind of echoing some of what as I'm reading between the lines, what I think he's saying. And of course, we'll all wait and see what his theory is. It might even have something to do with this hydroplate theory. But the idea that I think what he's going to say is that God did and God does use panspermia to spread life throughout the universe, and that maybe it started on the Earth, maybe it started somewhere else and also came here to the Earth and other places. We'll have to wait and see what he says. Now, while we're on Vatican astronomers, go ahead.
Let me just say something about that, because you know, the Jesus seed idea is not new. So I don't, you know, if he wants to call it mind-bending, fine. C.S. Lewis, I mean, it's just not new to have life elsewhere on other planets, and his Jesus seed theory actually goes farther than that you actually have, you know, God seeding life on planets the same way, the same process each time, and he'll even, Consul Magno even will say things like, there would be another, there'd be a Jesus on every one of these planets to redeem the planet, all that stuff. That's C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis got the idea, from predecessors as well. There's nothing new there. In fact, that's one of those. I think that's one of those quirky Catholic things that somehow or another they feel compelled to link the idea of multiple redeemers to this whole extraterrestrial question. I've blogged plenty of this on my UFO Religions blog, but that is not a necessary connection or extrapolation. But I'll just leave it there.
Well, that's a really good point. And by the way, tell people how they can learn more about you and about your websites.
Oh, okay. If you just go to www.drmsh, that's D as in dog, drmsh.com. That's my main website, and across the top are my other websites, links to my other websites and my blogs. And one of those is UFO Religions.
Okay, and I know you do actively blog and writing articles. Are you working on any new books?
Just the Myth That Is True, the first draft. I'm almost through the entire first draft of that. Other than that, it's a lot of blogging. I'm publishing articles in journals and things like that. And I write a lot for Bible Study Magazine. That's our magazine at work. I usually have an article or two in every issue of that.
Let's get back to these Vatican astronomers. I want to get your input on two or three things. One, all these recent comments from Father Gabriel Funes. Before him, Guy Cosmonago in the book that I referred to. Before that, Monsignor Corrado Balducci. By the way, Balducci made news, a few years ago when he said that ET is already here or has already made contact, and that people at the highest levels of the Vatican administration are aware of it. Now, when we talked to Nick Pope a couple of nights ago, and by the way, Nick Pope was invited to be part and was actually in attendance at these Royal Science meetings, interestingly. He said that he knows Monsignor Geraldo Balducci personally, and he believes that he is a very, very sincere man. He said that he would have a hard time believing that Balducci had made that up. And what an incredible statement that is, that extraterrestrials already are in contact. But anyway, he made news, and of course before him, Malachi Martin. There's been a whole slew of these astronomers in the last couple of decades, and they're getting noisier all the time, saying that they too also use a lot of incredible statements, that we have there is a certain possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, that we're nearer now than ever to disclosure, whatever, and it won't challenge the authority of the church. It will not unhinge the doctrine of Christ. Give me your response to what has been happening within an organization. It's the largest of its kind in the world. It's the oldest religious organization in history, some people say, and has 100 and some, different representatives around the world to different governments. What's happening here?
Well, my response is the same. I don't really care what the authority figure that is saying it is, but show me the extraterrestrial. Show me the proof. I don't doubt that Balducci believes that. Frankly, I think Balducci is not a very clear thinker. I spent a lot of time blogging through Balducci on my UFO Religions blog, because there are things that he affirms in a theological sort of way about extraterrestrials that comes, and I actually have examples, quoting Balducci and then quoting things from, for lack of a better term, pagan religious views like theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and all that occult sort of stuff that are just word for word, concept for concept the same. And my question to Balducci at the end of that series of blogs was, how can you affirm this and still affirm your faith, your position in the church? Because where these ideas lead are antithetical to Catholic doctrine, and you don't have to be a Catholic theologian to get there. I mean, you're talking about deity of Christ, you're talking about a Godhead. I mean, these fundamental ideas. So either he has not thought through that very well at all, or maybe the question hasn't even occurred to him. I just do not think he's a clear thinker, really, with respect to any of this. But I'm not going to say that he doesn't believe it. I won't even say that he didn't hear that from somebody else. I mean, he probably had a conversation with some people about the issue and what do you think, and look at all this weird stuff flying around. Do you think aliens are here? Oh yeah, they probably are. Until the day comes, when the church actually endorses that position, okay, then I'll be interested and I'll pay more attention. But then all that does is produce another question.
Yeah, but the church has not rebuked or repudiated him publicly either. And we do know that Balducci has done some joint commentary with Zechariah Sitchin, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. And in fact, we'll go right to that. But first, just to the larger question of the Vatican, why is the Vatican positioning itself publicly in this way? A conspiracy might say it's because they know something we don't. Others might say, well, it just comes down to them positioning their authority over the laity just in case. Do you have any kind of a gut feeling about why is the Vatican doing this?
I think that they're scared. I think they have a tremendous amount to lose if they are not prepared with a coherent response to their members, to their parishioners. In view of their past history, on scientific issues and whatnot, in view of the speed with which this kind of thing is disseminated, they would never recover if they were not laying groundwork before anything like this would ever be announced. They would just never recover their status, as people, to whom you should follow us, for spiritual guidance and all the other stuff. They would be toast if they were just caught completely empty-handed with this. So I tend to think that they're being smart by thinking about it and saying things about it, putting ideas out there that they can refer to. Oh yeah, we talked about that years ago. Big deal. It's exciting, but it doesn't bother us, theologically. Go back and read this and that. We've been there, done that. I mean, that's just strategically wise. I think it would actually be wise for the believing, Christian, evangelical Christian community to do the same thing. Because it could cut both ways. We've done a lot of work, myself and a bunch of other people, yourself included, about what if some of this is really sinister? What if it's demonic? And we've been down that road a lot. And I think the church, if that's what it turns out to be, the church would be prepared to recognize that. If that's not what it turns out to be, I think we need an equally and frankly more coherent response than lots of Jesuses running around on planets. We can do better than that, frankly.
And just so you know, that was exactly Chuck Missler's answer to that question. 2 years ago, studies by the government, some of these were funded by the government, some of them independently, Davies and others participated in those, and that suggested that ETI discovery might result in the complete collapse of society. Now, they were making comparisons about how underdeveloped cultures historically collapsed when suddenly they were faced with a far superior culture, an advanced civilization or whatever. But more recent polls now, and I realize that polls don't really tell us what would happen in a real-life scenario where all of a sudden you have an Independence Day mild-wide craft hovering over the White House, but most recent polling shows a vast difference now in public opinion. Most people, including Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, everybody that they polled, very high numbers of people saying that the ETI discovery would not contradict their faith, wouldn't change their religious faith. You often lecture on whether Christianity could handle an ET reality. What do you think about this change in public opinion?
Well, I agree that there has been a profound change. The latest survey on this was led by a guy named Ted Peters, who's actually out here in the Pacific Northwest, and that was the first of these kinds of surveys. There have been 4 or 5 of them that included self-described evangelicals, and the results are pretty much similar. That this, like, it wasn't a who cares, but it's like that's interesting, it's fascinating, but it doesn't bother my faith, really in any regard. Now, the flip side of that is, there will be those who say, well, it doesn't bother people because they're so theologically illiterate anyway. I think that's a bit cynical because I'm not theologically illiterate, and I do think that what I would call a conservative evangelical Christianity should just go on without a blip. If there were extraterrestrials out there, it wouldn't bother me in the least theologically. I don't have any theological problem with it. And again, I'm not one that has incarnations of Jesus all over the place or lots of Jesuses. I think that's just silly. It's one of my gripes with the whole Christian discussion on this, which is dominated by Catholicism. So I don't have any problem with it, and I think it's actually a good sign that people are thinking this way. But let me have my own caveat here. I think I would feel better about it if people could articulate why they don't have a problem with it. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a far cry between, I heard somebody on the radio, or I read this article, and that guy didn't have a problem with it, so I'm not going to either if there's ever ET out there. I would feel better about the average person in the pew if they could really navigate through it in their own head, their own mind theologically. I just think that would give us a more stable church and a more stable response. Should we have something like this, ever become an actual factual reality? And I'm not optimistic that a lot of believers can do that. A lot of believers can articulate much more tried and true components of their theology, and so I'm a little apprehensive, not at the idea of ET life. I'm apprehensive that if and when that is announced, whether it's true or not, you're going to have people like the Sitchenites just swoop down on Bible believers and redefine all the terms and reframe the whole issue. And I am not optimistic that we have an army of believers that are capable of dismissing the very poor argumentation by the ancient astronaut crowd. And to me, that is a threat. So it's not really the idea of ET being existing that I am worried about. I'm worried about what will be done with it, and how believers, I think, will be victimized by a false framing, a false articulation of the implications.
Well, and of course, this is the reason why you're committed to doing so much on your websites. You've got about a minute and a half, Mike. Tell us again how people can learn more about you, about your work, about your book, The Facade. Can they get The Facade on your website?
Yeah, if they just go to drmsh.com, everything is there. My other websites and my blogs are at the top. Very easy to see, and then there's a navigation panel on the left that they can order The Facade. They can become a fan on Facebook, all that sort of thing. So everything's there at one central location. That is the Nerve Center, drmsh.com.
All right, we've been talking to Dr. Michael Hieser, Ph.D. in Ancient Semitic Languages. We want to encourage you to go to his website, get his book. This will be turned, of course, into a commercial product, and it will be widely distributed, and we hope that we can send a lot of people to you. Dr. Hieser, thank you very much for being part of Official Disclosure, this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio.
Thank you, Tom, for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio. We'll continue in a moment. Don't go away.